welcome you tonight to our conversation about stress and resilience. I'm Dacher Keltner. I'm a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center, and have devoted a lot of my career to the study of positive emotions and their place in human adaptation and how the good life and how we can handle stress. And it is my deep privilege and honor to be in conversation tonight with Professor Elissa Epel, who's at University of California at San Francisco. She's vice chair of her Department of Psychiatry and Behavior Science, a member of the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine. And as you will learn tonight, she probably is the preeminent young stress researcher, really exploring how chronic stress changes the nervous system. She is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, president of Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, and wrote a book you may have read, The Telomere Effect, with Liz Blackburn, which was a New York Times bestseller and really brought to the public's attention her very important research. So, Elissa, it's great to be with you.
Dacher, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be in dialogue with you. We've never done this before in the 20 years of being friends.
Oh, I know. And we've had many different kinds of conversations, and I could think of only one person to bring in and talk about stress and resilience. So I guess by way of introduction, we're having this conversation. It is a unique moment in our history, as has been much reported. Vivek Murthy really talked about the social recession that lies ahead of coming out of this pandemic and reorienting to life with all the people we've lost and the stress that's ensued. There's a lot of data out on just the levels of stress in people in the United States, 3 to 4 times the usual levels, the levels of depression, the kinds of grief, that 500,000 people have passed. People have not been able to see their grandkids or go to graduations or merit weddings and the like. I think there could be no better time for us to think together about stress and resilience. I'm sure our audience is aware of kind of this remarkable science on stress. And in some sense, it begins 60, 70 years ago. Robert Sapolsky wrote about the history of the study of stress, and then these incredible discoveries about how when we're stressed and we don't feel like we have the resources to handle what's in front of us, the system in our body, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, kicks into action, cortisol moves through our body, and we feel like we're fight or flight ready. All good in the short term, but then when it's long term, right, and it's chronic and we're ruminating about it, and it's part of every part of the fabric of our daily life, things really get really problematic. I'm curious, you've been studying chronic stress for 20 years, 15, 20 years. How do we think today about the nature of chronic stress? What makes it chronic?
It's a great question, and you've already mentioned some of the critical ingredients that turn a stressful situation into something that causes a full body dysregulation over months or years. And that is our mind's perseveration on stress, that the actual event that we're trying to cope with or survive usually is very short-lived itself, but it's that ongoing process of either ruminating after it happens or anticipating what's happening next. And I would say that when this pandemic has created so many different types of stress for different people. So I think of it as one storm, many boats, given our resources. But there is one thing in common, and that is the mental stress, the chronic stress of uncertainty. We hate uncertainty. That's just how we're built. We want to know what's going to happen next. And this has revealed that we absolutely live with chronic uncertainty. Especially now, especially with climate and especially with COVID. It's just right in front of us. We can plan today. We can't plan next month.
Yeah. I have to ask you, that's so striking, and it tells us that, we have these existential circumstances, almost like, the Second World War for people in London or whatever the case may be. And we have this mental orientation that turns it into this chronic stress, grounded in uncertainty. I know you've been working a bit with the CDC and advising in different contexts. What are you seeing as being some of the fundamental mental uncertainties that people are grappling with during COVID?
So the range of pandemic stressors, as we know and now see across the world, is, gets at the threat to loved ones, to family, the threat
Yeah.
to our own lives. So the loss in the most fundamental form of life, but then the existential threat of what our future is,
Yeah.
and our children's future,
Yeah.
and especially with this larger climate context. So existential threat is something we haven't quite had in our generation until
Yeah.
it's been crystallized now. And that's just going to take a whole nother set of adjustment, of coping tools, of mental flexibility. And we've just had a taste of it, but I do believe that the mental preparedness is the next challenge for our future, is preparing us to, while we embrace the unexpected and the uncertainty, to activate all of this emotion we have of caring for each other and the earth, to be doing what we can, to be helping, to be doing things
Yeah.
for the greater good, because
Yeah.
without that, it's just game over in so many ways.
Yeah.
So your question about what makes stress chronic, I'll just mention two really fundamental things that people probably see, but they don't think about in the way that we do as researchers. We quantify resources. So material, financial, emotional, social, those break it up. Those may have made the pandemic so much easier for people with resources.
Yeah.
And the other is simple: breaks. So it's resilience means bouncing back. It
Yeah.
really is about the law of physics. And so is, if you think about our body, and is this going to be chronic stress, and is it going to dysregulate, or is it going to be acute stress? It comes down to the math of giving our body breaks. And so when we have been jumping in to help our frontline providers at
Yeah.
UCSF and elsewhere,
Yeah.
some of the simplest advice has been
Yeah.
what's between them and developing PTSD. People must breathe and give their body a break,
Yeah.
and not wait till they get a weekend or a vacation. It's like every hour,
Yeah.
or a period every day.
I know, it's so striking, and we're going to get to the kind of the resilient side of this equation. But I think if you look writ large at the literature on gratitude and mindfulness and walking and awe walks and silver linings and all these different themes in the resilience literature, what they tell us, the science is like just a couple of minutes every now and then really matters. And we have to keep sight on that. Building on your discussion of uncertainty, it's interesting. I have to say that, in the 16 months of this pandemic, or 15 months, that does define my experience. And it was uncertain what it was, and it was uncertain how perilous it was. And there were debates about how many people would die, and it was uncertain about where it came from. Our narrative was uncertain. Then we had the political context of the election, and our democracy became uncertain. And now we have this almost absurd, if you will, uncertainty about vaccines, and you're taking action on this, and I'm excited by this new kind of scientist who takes what they learn in the lab and looks at the world and says, wow, we've got to help out. What have you been doing with vaccinations, and how do you think about this new uncertainty in this moment of the pandemic?
It is a super exciting opportunity to look at all these fundamental discoveries from stress science from the last 50 years.
Yeah.
And so we've, my colleagues and I at UCSF have just had the opportunity to, devise a study that will be both practical, as well as really examining these constructs that we can measure, like how much we tolerate uncertainty. Does that matter for our immune system? Does that matter for our antibody response? So what we have done is asked, can we predict how strong your immune system will mount an antibody response to this new vaccine based on several things? So one is how much chronic stress you've been under. And we already know from other vaccination studies that matters. But it's been usually something like bereavement or caregiving. So now we have this whole, interlocked layers of pandemic stress that we can measure: job loss and children at home, relationships, conflict at home. So all of these types of stressors that have been, in a bit magnified or accelerated because of COVID, we've been adding them up. Are you exposed to the stressor? How much has it impacted your life? And that would be just a real basic question that we expect we know the answer. But the other half of this, and you'll like this, and you've helped me devise the battery, is what we haven't measured about how people survive adversity. And that is, what is the larger context of their well-being in life, their purpose, their sense of how much they feel support from others, how much they get, feel that they're doing things for the greater good when they wake up in the morning. Do they feel meaning in what they do? So, and gratitude. So these are, I really think of it as, in a sense, you can't measure one without the other. So we know that chronic stress dampens the antibody response and really, wreaks havoc on our immune system. But if we understand the how much one is scaffolded from these stress responses by their well-being, I think we're going to have a better answer. And the other piece that we've been measuring is age. So we know COVID has really revealed the effects of the older immune system and how vulnerable it can be, and that's been terrifying. But biological age is something we can also measure. So we're looking at the kind of the age of cells in different ways, senescence, and of course telomeres, one of my favorite measures. And
tell us about telomeres. And I think that thanks to people like Robert Sapolsky, I always teach the first chapter in the history of stress research is this HPA axis, the amygdala. It's activated when we perceive threat in the environment, and then cortisol, when chronically present in the body, is tough news on our heart and other realms. And then along come younger scientists like you, and it's like, actually there are other stories to tell, one being inflammation, and you've hinted at that, and then the telomere effect. What are those?
So the telomeres are a quite interesting story about a biomarker of biological age. And we can take any, I often tease people and say, so do you have any telomeres? And by now, most people know what they are, but they're in every single cell of everybody, and we all have them. And when we understand and know about them and how they work, I think it helps people take care of them, and they're motivated to understand that their telomeres are sensitive structures that are listening to our thoughts and our feelings, and are feeling the impact of chronic stress when it's uncountered by restoration and by support. So I guess it was probably about 17 years ago, I started looking around to try to understand aging as a process early in life, not disease onset, which you can only measure after midlife or so, but rather what is speeding up the clock of aging. And I was very lucky to have Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF, and
Nobel Prize winner.
Right. And Zhulin, our triad, our third colleague, who's been working in this endeavor with me. So Liz did win the Nobel Prize for discovering this, the caps on the ends of the chromosomes and the enzyme that regulates them, telomerase. And it's this anti-aging system that is, we find this in single cell organisms all the way up to humans. And it's pretty much determines the how the length of a cell's life. So if you have long telomeres, that cell can go on and divide and become, somewhat immortal. So telomeres track biological time. They're loosely correlated with age, but they're really responding to not only how much cells are dividing, but the wear and tear in the cell, in our body. So oxidative stress, stress hormones, insulin resistance, all of these factors that go up when we're chronically stressed are wearing down and shortening the telomeres. So the short story of telomeres, and this is an unusual version of it, but I think this is one that is people will understand, is simply that telomeres are affected by the stress hormones, cortisol, right in the cell. They're affected by our perceptions of stress, and that was what we discovered 17 years ago. And now we know it's related to any chronic adversity, any chronic conditions. It's related to our how much social support we have, but even distal factors like our neighborhood. If we're living in a neighborhood and we feel unsafe, that is related to shorter telomeres, regardless of how much money you have, how much education you have. So these social factors are shaping our aging. And so that brings me to, really wanting to also understand how social inequity and social context is shaping our aging. And Dacher, this is just a great opportunity to ask you about, as someone who has been obsessed with social status and power, how you think about this issue of health. And your book, The Power Paradox, was, absolutely, I think, changed how all of us, think about power. And one thing you've said is, power is shaping every aspect of our life, even if we don't notice it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. And by the way, I'm not obsessed with status. I am obsessed with studying status. No, I'm teasing you. So, I was a social psychologist, and, the first thing that you realize is Bertrand Russell got it right, that power is for social sciences what energy is to physics, that it's all the laws of social relationships have to be thought of in terms of power and how we influence each other. It begins from the minute you're developing in your mom's, womb, where you're struggling over resources, and it ends when you leave this world, right? In terms of your life expectancy, power, influence is just part of the story. And I was carrying out studies as a social psychologist of power, this capacity to influence. How do we get it? What does it do to our minds? It makes us kind of a little more simplistic. What does it do to our behavior? We become a little unethical. One of the studies that got a lot of attention, the car study, if you drive a BMW fancy car, you're more likely to violate the rules of the road. And as I was doing this research on what power does to us, I was tracking your kind of science, right? The studies of inflammation and cortisol and the HPA axis and how hard your heart is pumping. And what we started to see is that your body, as you've been describing, if you get a neighborhood effect on telomeres activity, whether I'm living in a resource-rich neighborhood or not, affects the cells in my body. Why would that be? It's power, right? And so what our research was showing, and people like you and others, is if I feel powerless and I don't have voice, and I am excluded by society, or I am subjugated, or I'm on the outs, all of these health problems that you've been talking about, Elissa, are accentuated. And so you can go down the list, right? If I'm a woman and I hear a sexist comment, I have elevated stress response physiologically. If I'm African American and I hear racist language, you will show an elevated stress response. If I'm at work and people around me don't respect me, same thing. Work showing if I'm excluded or rejected or ostracized, pain regions in my brain light up. And so what that tells us is, our health today. And people are showing this epidemiologically too. You grow up in the wrong neighborhood, if you're victimized by race, if you don't get an inclusive education, you're more likely to die younger, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, it fits this story, that we've been telling on the emotions, which is we're a hypersocial species. We survived in our evolution together. And in our proximal lives here, we don't do well if we don't have strong social ties. And to me, the physiological data was most compelling. So
Dacher, are you able to tell us what matters more, objective power or subjective sense of power?
It's such a profound story, which is, as some of the work, the early, what's called social ladder work of Nancy Adler and others, and you were in that work as well, showed, and this paper got me interested deeply in hierarchy, which is on a 10-rung ladder where you place yourself vis-a-vis your society, right? In terms of status, subjective status, each rung up the ladder you go, the longer you live, right? And that blew my mind. If I'm a 7 and my neighbor's an 8, and we go to the same doctor, we eat the same food, we live next door to each other, she's going to live longer than me, or he, right? Controlling for a lot of factors. And so that told us that subjective power matters, but objective power matters a lot too, right? It really matters what your education is, the bottom line in your bank account. So and sometimes one matters more than the other. And that's a very interesting question for work. So So I think our audience is probably hungry for some good news because we've talked about, stress and COVID and, how the mind turns sort of the environment into chronic stressors and the perils of the telomere effect. And I'd love to shift to your thinking about resilience. And you kind of gave us this nice definition of like bouncing back, and it's rooted in physics and the resiliency of our minds and our bodies and our nervous systems. And I think that the literature broadly defined on our capacity to adapt, our resilience, highlights a lot of really interesting tricks, if you will, or practices that can transform this physiological profile of stress to one of thriving, right? Or even positive stress, I guess you would say, things like being mindful or gratitude, finding silver linings in hardship. Is there such a thing as positive stress? Do you believe in that? I'm skeptical, but try to convince me otherwise.
Well, let's talk about that. So, so let's define it really granularly. So there are different levels or types of positive stress. And there is growing from adversity. There's the strength and the result of flexing the muscle of needing to grow and develop skills. And so that's one story that we should talk about. There is the mindset of when you experience a stressor of making it positive. So let's call that positive challenge mindset. And then there is what I'm going to call positive stress in the body. And this is the most concrete form of positive stress, period.
Wow.
And
what is that?
Just give your body a shot of stress, a jolt of acute stress. And what happens is that the counter-regulatory response wins. We are so well built to respond to a short-term stressor and recover that it's not just that we're back to baseline, but we've actually turned on resilience biology called hormetic stress. But what really is happening is that the cell is saying, well, we got to turn on all the cleanup systems. We got to scavenge all the oxidative stress and free radicals, and it's a chance to get rid of junk in the cell because it's cleanup time. So as long as you've given yourself a recovery after an acute stressor, you're probably better off in the end.
Wow. So can you give some examples? So if I love swimming in cold water in the summer, hiking in the Sierras, and I come out and I'm jolted and I have this sensation, is that that is?
I'll tell you that for humans, since we can't, there's a lot of stressors that have been studied in like worms and flies that make them live longer, but most of them we can't, UV shocks and chemicals. But for us, it's temperature. So hot exposure, cold exposure.
Really?
Hot, cold, alternate. Absolutely. There have been a lot of studies. So these studies are not on people, but we're starting to do them on people. But there's a lot of studies showing that these short-term stressors are creating biological changes that basically make our mood better and our aging younger. So let me give you a more specific example. When we talked about temperature, hypoxic breathing is a practice. There's many different forms of it from different traditions. Exercise.
What is it?
Okay, so the last one, exercise, everyone's thought of that. That was the only one on the table for a long time, and now we're starting to study that and other ones. High intensity interval training is for sure a hermetic stressor. So what we've been studying at UCSF with my colleagues, Wendy Mendez and Eric Prather, we've been studying the Wim Hof method, and it's a really nice package. So you expose yourself to cold stress and you expose yourself to a hypoxic breathing.
Nice.
And here's what I love about it the most. There's a pairing. So I would just choose yoga and relaxation if it was up to me, but I do know and understand that we all need these aerobic or challenging physiological stressors too. And I hate the cold, but what you do when you're in the cold shower or immersing in ice is that you say to yourself, my body loves this. I can relax into it. There's no growth without challenge. So the whole mindset is pushing yourself toward the edge of discomfort, but relaxing into it. It's amazing. It doesn't come naturally.
I'm not convinced.
Mind training. We'll wait, we'll see what we find in our studies, but there's already been studies on the Wim Hof method. And it looks like it is, in a sense, anti-inflammatory in 2 different studies. So 10 days of this intense training led to young healthy men being able to be exposed to endotoxin, but not having the big inflammatory reaction. And
Right.
then there was a study with an autoimmune disorder where it looked like the method reduced their inflammation. We'll see. Early studies, but exciting idea.
So walk me through this, Elissa. I'm still skeptical, but I'm becoming convinced. For 20 years, I've done saunas, and the audience doesn't need to know that, but it is relevant here. And I go do a sauna with a friend, and you sweat and it's hot and you get hyperventilating and shifts in cardiovascular system. And I walk out as if I've visited the Dalai Lama in the Himalayas. Like I feel at one with the world, and I can handle any stress, and I get the parking ticket outside and it's no problem. And I go home and my kids are all peaceful. So how is that working? How is that shock to the system of heat changing this concept of stress that we've been talking about in the mind?
So there's changes at every level of physiology, and at the nervous system level, and I know you're thinking this because I know you've studied this, the vagus nerve is responsive. Yeah, so we're really increasing the vagal, the vagus gets a workout. So it's big vagal withdrawal and then a big vagal rebound, maybe even better than and higher than where you were at baseline.
So if I might just let our audience know, the vagus nerve, which I'm obsessed with, begins in the top of your spinal cord, largest bundle of nerves in the mammalian nervous system, works through the throat, helps you vocalize, slows down heart, breathing, helps with digestion. It's kind of the mind-body, one of the mind-body nexuses. Glad to know it's activated during the sauna.
Yeah. It is, I would agree with you. I think that there's so many different practices that make us feel good, contemplative practices, mind-body practices, and probably the one common thing to them all is this vagus response that we get.
Yeah, I agree.
And one thing, just in terms of thinking about power, is we don't realize this because it's invisible, but this feeling of safety, social safety, is a prerequisite for having this deep relaxation response. And my colleague at UCSF, Alexandra, is writing a whole paper with a group of us, and the title is Deep Rest. We don't really think about, we think we're either stressed or relaxed. We're kind of, baseline is not normal. We're actually pretty aroused and vigilant. And that deep rest comes when we feel safe.
Yeah, and you think about, you talked earlier about the uncertainty of COVID. You think about the political crisis. You think about George Floyd and shooting and just how safety became, the country became unsafe. And we saw 9 shootings this past weekend, and, so very concerning.
So Dacher, can I ask you about the positive emotions as another resilience factor?
Yeah.
Because I have to say that I really want to believe that these positive emotions will save us and promote stress resilience. And so I have questions.
Yeah.
So let's take awe first. I didn't understand why you got, you started doing all of these lab studies on awe and, did over a decade ago. And now I cannot believe that we missed it, that we didn't see how important this was as one of the fundamental emotions, how it's one of the few transformative or transcendent emotions.
Yeah.
And my question is this: it is clearly so powerful, but could it actually help us engage in behaviors that are, let's say, sustainability behaviors? If we're feeling connected to nature, does it really make a difference?
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's ironic. So that, awe, people have been thinking about awe since people have been writing about human beings for several thousand years. What is a mystical experience? What is my relationship to nature? What is my relationship to the divine? And social science and health science that you and I are part of just had ignored it, with some, theoretical exceptions. Awe is when we encounter vast things we don't understand. And then and a lot of lab studies show our sense of self gets smaller. We feel like we're connected to larger things like ecosystems, spiritual forces, communities, most typically, or big ideas. We get really curious about the world. Our minds open. Darwin's biggest discoveries, that led to his theory of evolution were almost psychedelic experiences of awe, where he was, and one in particular, which I love, it's at the end of The Origin of Species. He wakes from a dream on this river and sees this bank of trees and branches and insects and birds and flora and fauna, and suddenly has this insight about evolution, which you would think about. And then awe, a lot of work shows, makes us committed to community. We share and we put aside our differences. We're really interested in other people. The deeper question that you're asking is about health. Is it one of these forms of transformation, right? Where we can go from cortisol and inflammation and amygdala activation in your brain, all the stress, the parts of the stress system. And frankly, Elissa, the data are coming in, and I actually think awe is maybe the most central pathway to healing and to resilience that we can find. Emerson wrote about awe, being out in nature. There's nothing that nature cannot repair. Hundreds of studies find when I'm out in nature, from my experience of awe, my nervous system looks better. I don't know if they're telomere findings, but inflammation is lower, et cetera. When I am dancing and finding awe, there's new science showing it influences the opioid system. I feel stronger. There's a lot of interest right now in psychedelics. Berkeley just started a center, several different kinds of psychedelics. It's always important to note the risks and that it's illegal, but the right use of psychedelics is helping people with depression and anxiety and trauma and fearing dying and OCD and so on. And a young scientist, Peter Hendricks, has said that moves through awe, right? 65% of people on psychedelics feel like that's the most awesome experience I've had in my life. So that's
but does it stay with them? I mean, is awe a transient emotion?
Yeah, but that's a billion-dollar question, right? You have a big experience of awe. You go backpacking, or you hear Beyonce, or you're at a political rally, right? You're overwhelmed, and we know it transforms the mind in the moment in radical ways. It deactivates the default mode network, which is your default operations of the self. That shuts down. So you see all these things. The question is, how long does that last? And people say, well, I'll ask you, Elissa, have you had an experience of awe that years ago that's still with you?
On psychedelics.
Or no, on any kind of experience. Okay. Put aside psychedelics, any realm.
That was my answer, by the way. But let me tell you, I just had a conversation with my sister. She wrote the foreword to her new book, and it talked about an experience when she was 18 on a mountain, a transformative awe experience. And I was like, can you take that out? Is it really that important? Not everyone's had that. People can't relate to that. And she's like, that's why I am who I am today. That's why I wrote this book. It was that lasting. So that was some data.
Yeah.
Really. So let me ask you another question. I am very taken and influenced by the scientific literature on awe. And I'm paying more attention to my own awe. I'm not suppressing it. I'm letting myself seek it more. But I think you and I both care a lot about preserving nature and climate change. Yeah. What would your ideal intervention be for reducing carbon output globally? I know that's obviously a huge it's the big question, but how would we get there? How do we get there?
Well, it's funny, Elissa, the past 2 years in many ways have been, the hardest of my life, which is I lost my younger brother, who was a companion in awe. We had this remarkable childhood, and then COVID, and that was 2 years of my life. And I really felt the high stress profile that you have brilliantly described tonight, which is I felt the heat of inflammation, and I felt the chronic stress, and my mind was fixated on problems, and my cells were probably aging prematurely. And I literally had this epiphany where it's like, I study awe. I have to go live it, right? Period. And that has to be my guiding philosophy. And everything I did was largely low carbon footprint, which is find awe near trees on my walk, and look at clouds in the sky and find awe. Listen to music. And these are all universal sources of awe. Listen to music in a way that would bring awe. Find visual things like many forms of indigenous arts in Mesoamerica. Just study them and immerse myself in them. Get back to the big ideas that I love of Darwin and others. And I could feel it transform me literally in the hardest period of my life. And those are lessons for today, which is I got all of those without hopping into a car, without hopping on a plane, without buying something, and by preserving the environment. And we know awe is very good for the environment. So I think, one of the things I'm excited about with respect to awe is it's meant to shift paradigms. Our experiences of awe, by definition, transform how we understand the world. And awe has this paradigm shifting quality. Maybe the exercise we need is just walking in a garden. Maybe how we handle PTSD is not necessarily through SSRIs, it's through awe, right? And I think these are all open hypotheses that I would venture as an answer to your question.
I absolutely love that answer and fully believe it, and still have a question, which is,
sure.
How do we move from the individual to shifting a paradigm socially, so culturally? So here's my year, which has been also hard and full of climate distress. And especially for all of us in the Bay Area, it's, it is not a future event. It's here now. And we can ignore that we're going to be having our forest burn, but it's going to be here before we know it again. And, we have such an amazing mind that we can suppress and ignore it and act like life is normal, but it's not. So I have been trying to move into the climate area and ask, well, what can I do here? And it's been, I think on one hand, we should all, we should ask what's the most important challenge to our field or pressing issue, and why aren't we studying it?
I know.
What can we do?
No, I agree.
And so we all can do a part. We just have to figure out what that is. So for me, I think my climate, I started jumping into this project and was so excited, and then saw the barriers. Reducing individual climate footprint wasn't going to be an impactful outcome. And I had to, I basically was stalled and realized I felt helpless. And I don't want to spread hopelessness, but the fact is I felt like, my skill set doesn't work here. And the individual, so I want to read a quote from your Power Paradox book. Real power means enhancing the greater good. Feelings of power will direct you to the exact way you're best equipped to do this. Power makes the difference in the world by influencing others. So that is the answer I found, is in changing my mental paradigm to one of, well, we are absolutely emotionally contagious, our hope, our optimism. And, part of what I'm working on now is shifting the dialogue and helping people feel powerful and influential in the climate area. And this is a complete work in progress. So I would love to know your thoughts about, how do we become powerful? How do we feel powerful? How do we create a culture of powerful goodness and action?
Well, I think in some, and thank you for the broader social framing here. I mean, I think that, part of the struggle with climate is figuring out specific courses of action. And you can do that with, carbon calculators and so forth. But part of it is a reconceptualization of what our relationship to the world is, right? And that Bertrand Russell suggested, whom I quoted earlier, begins with power and I think awe in some sense. And I think that one answer is you find in the natural world things that make you feel awe, right? And provide those as forms of healing for humans and our ecosystems. So we did a study where we took veterans and kids in poor high schools in the Bay Area who didn't get to go camping like I did as a kid, and took them out rafting, and we saw a 30% drop in PTSD in our veterans over the course of a week-long period. That's using and giving to ecosystems as forms of healing, like we're now seeing with forest bathing and other kinds of interventions. I have to draw our audience's attention to another remarkable scientist who's engaged in this, Suzanne Simard. Her book, The Mother Tree, it's about the neurological networks of trees. She's a scientist like you, Elissa, and me, and she's like, I study trees, how they communicate, how they take care of each other, even other species. They'll protect other species of trees. Remarkable, right? She's like, Canada is losing old growth forest. I'm going to create this project, Suzanne Simard, to build up the forest, build up trees, build up gardens, right? I'm curious, how are you tackling this, right? You've done all this groundbreaking work on chronic stress hurting our bodies. You've been thinking about interventions of different kinds, right? Around getting people vaccinated and the like. You've done mindfulness work, which we haven't talked about too much. How does that science point you in the direction of doing a small part in the climate change we need?
Well, I've wanted to understand how the science of the mind can help us with the global technical challenge of stopping our carbon use and sequestering reducing the carbon that exists. And one colleague, for example, I've talked to, who's been studying this for decades, said, it's not altruism and attitudes don't predict behavior. It's all about influencing the policymakers. And while that's true, I think if you think of a diagram of the systems, the actual technical and behavioral changes we need are shaped completely by social systems, values, culture. And so it's the systems that we need to change. And on the very outer circle is really our collective mindset. Are we going to be, completely looking away and living our lives in a selfish way, which I was going to say how we're wired, but your whole book is how we're not wired for that, but how we can nudge ourselves to be globally minded and interconnected, and have that be this kind of social quantum shift in our social behavior. And so I've been very influenced by people who have been basically writing about it's not about forcing people to change. It's like, we are the solution. Inspire us, help us feel the awe and interconnected with nature. And then we will move together toward these solutions. We are the policymakers, and we are all living. They are people like us, and they have children like us who can be influenced and influence them. And we have political agency. So we have our individual mind, our attitudes. We have our kind of, let's just say, we can influence public will, and that can influence political will. So these are all interconnected systems. So the way that I'm coping with this is to understand that because of the interconnectivity that is there, that we can't see across systems, we just need to work both, in our own ecosystem where we have power, and reach across the levels of influence as much as we can, wherever we are, whoever we are in the world.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think that, when I teach the science of happiness and resilience at Berkeley, I talk about this model of who we are as which is Homo economicus. We're selfish, we're greedy, we want competitive advantage over others. And that model is just a model of human beings. It aligns with some neuroscience, but there's a lot of science on Born to Be Good. And it's done a disservice to our environment, right? Mm-hmm. So, and our community. So it's time to shift our sense of what our power is and what our influence is.
Yeah, Born to Be Good should be a textbook in schools as soon as they're old enough to read it.
I wish they could.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, but just the goodness that we have if we allow the conditions for it to be expressed and to come out. And in turn,
I'm going to be turning now, and this is a note to our audience. Please send us your questions. I have a big question remaining for Elissa to put our conversation together. and then a couple final thoughts that we want to share. But please send us your questions, and we're going to be taking them on. So the first question, Elissa, and it's actually right in the realm of your own work for 17 years that now has been replicated across, I don't know, 15 countries, a couple 100,000 participants. I mean, it's a big effect, this telomere effect. And the question is there research on telomere health of people who are married to caregivers or caregivers of addicts? You know, and we're part of the kind of the cultural malaise, if you will, of our country right now is this death by despair, and some people are dying younger because of drug addictions and opiates and the like. You yourself did work on caregivers, and you think about, you know, you're 75 years old and your partner gets dementia, or you're really poor and you're trying to raise kids and keep your mother healthy. Yeah. What have we learned about caregiving, stress, and have we learned anything about taking care of drug addicts?
So it's a great question, and there have been, you know, the two answers are: one, our telomeres are correlated with who we live with, so we are shaping and influencing each other, or we are commonly shaped by common factors in our, you know, in our family system. And so, for example, spouses have telomeres that are correlated stronger the longer they've been married. So if you know, it's a really significant difference. New couples, their telomeres are not really correlated. They've, you know, for couples over like 50 years old, we start getting a stronger and stronger correlation. So what does that mean? It's not just that we select people like us, but rather that we are influencing each other. And I think one of the factors that we should never forget is just that we are, in a sense, synchronizing or contagious in our emotions and our physiology. Yeah. And there's been so many great studies showing that, particularly in families and couples and lab interactions. And so yes, it is hard to be a caregiver. Yeah. And it is important to those, you know, the self-care, the breaks, the respite, they're not just options, they're actually essential. Otherwise, caregivers in some studies have died earlier than the dementia patient that they're taking care of, or their partner. So it is a tremendous strain. And of course, we know that addiction is, you know, and mental health are extremely challenging problems to live with and to care about the person who is.
You know, I want to ask you a question, Elissa, you know, based on your remarkable work on caregiving, which really has changed my life, frankly. When, you know, my brother was ill, and it's tough to watch a young man get colon cancer. You know, I was in this state, and I would honestly recommend a lot of people in our audience, you know, Roshi Joan Halifax's book, Being with Dying. I read it, and she has these exercises about how do you sit next to someone you love whose body is just being wiped out and they're in pain. And one of her recommendations is just kind of separating your stress from that person's stress through these contemplative approaches, right? Finding your compassion and compassion's different than empathic distress. I have to ask you this, like, I'm sure you're asked a lot, like, God, I'm going through this hardest moment in my life. My partner X is ill. And what do you tell people like that? What are some take breaks, self-care? What do you say to them just to get them on the path to resilience?
You know, there's not one thing that is helpful for everyone. So it's like we all need to have a toolkit or figure out what it is for us. And I think, you know, nature is clearly one that is accessible and works for a lot of people. Is getting outside and having that experience of letting nature actually do the work, because while mindfulness practices are extremely helpful, they take training and effort. Yeah. And when you're in nature, you actually have that psychological restoration, that release of rumination and cognitive load that can come with that forest bathing and that immersion in that sensory experience. So what do I tell people? I think the self-care and reaching out for help and support are really the first step. And then there's a lot of menus of options. But we talked about, this whole mindfulness movement has been so helpful to people, and people find it through distress and adversity,
Yeah.
and it helps calm them. But it really is about helping see reality clearly and
Yeah.
what we can and cannot control. And so it doesn't just stop there, but it's
That's huge.
actually helping us see, we can try to impact and influence the causes and conditions, the things that are right in front of us, but we can never control outcomes.
Yeah.
We can't control someone else's addiction.
Yeah.
And it's every day you need to remind yourself that, and to accept that you can witness and you can be there, but ultimately this is, people, even older kids, that once they're on their trajectory, you don't control them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's an understanding of uncertainty, right? It's tolerating uncertainty and embracing it. And that's
Right.
hard. But I do think that what we've been talking about using the goodness of our natural qualities for the common good, it really is aligned with mindfulness, in that we're, a real mindful warrior is not just doing this to be a monk and isolated. They're actually embracing uncertainty. Many are out on the front lines of social justice and environment, or in the personal realm, helping another person in a way that only they can. And so that's like being a mindful warrior, being present and compassionate, but also having the distance to say, I can't control this outcome. I can't control this person. I can only have the goodwill and compassion to be present.
Yeah, nice. We have a big question coming up, but we have another question about how do we cultivate awe in children? And I love this question because I think a lot of culture and our natural environments have been designed by evolution in humans to cultivate awe. And that's how we relate to these things and so education and bringing kids up is about getting them into nature and finding parts of culture that are really inspiring to them. And I'll give you a philosophical recommendation and then a couple of examples. Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, and really one of the most important environmentalists in the 20th century, right, alerted us to the toxic effects of DDT and really stirred a bunch of people in the 50s, has this brilliant essay on how to teach your child to wonder. And wonder is the mental state that follows experiences of awe, where you want to learn about things you don't know. You want to dive into mysteries of life. And her essay has all these practical contemplative exercises, like take your child out and let them listen to a bird and see where the bird song goes, right? Let them listen to rain or waves, follow the patterns of clouds or waves. And it is this whole contemplative approach to awe in children. And I think that, there's no substitute. It's a central theme of getting kids outdoors, getting them in parks. Music is a classic realm in the visual arts. We often short shrift painting and the visual arts as part of a very essential element of education. There's a lot of data showing it's great for kids. So a lot of good techniques there. Elissa, here's our next question. And in a way, I think the question speaks to a hunger that a lot of people are feeling right now, or a sort of an opening, which is we've been through a pandemic. We've been through a horrible political period. Quite frankly, we've confronted yet again the 400 years of racism. And the question is, okay, you guys are stress and happiness researchers. How can this change our society, right? How can it get into schools or healthcare? And I'll tell the person who asked the question that, there's a lot of work. For example, we profile at the Greater Good Science Center and promote. This stuff is in thousands of schools and growing, right? And that's very good news. I know you and I do a lot of work in healthcare, Elissa. I work with doctors and leaders of the Permanente Medical Group as one example of how do we build this stuff into hospitals during COVID? How do we get opportunities for nature or awe or gratitude? What do you see as some of the really exciting developments, maybe even revolutionary developments in schools or hospitals or other systems that we should care about.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Greater Good Science Center has been probably the biggest outreach of applying this science to the public and to schools. So Dacher, just so much gratitude to you for building the center, your vision there. And it's really had an impact. One of the things COVID has, this big question of like, so we do have the science that should help us. Now it's time. What are you going to do? It really has been a big challenge. And the model that I've embraced has been understanding where we've experienced communal trauma, and the solution is in communal healing, not in individual therapy. We must have individual help for those who need it, who are really suffering, who are very vulnerable to depression, anxiety, and have actually developed severe mental illness or impairment. I mean, the masses of people who have actually developed clinical disorders is very high, but I don't think of it as psychopathology or clinical disorder. It's a natural response to what has happened.
Well put.
And so what is communal healing? It is actually found between people who have experienced similar traumas. And it is about creating community together to heal that. And I've learned a lot from Jack Saul, who is a trauma therapist who's been there for 9/11 and other, war refugees and other groups. And what he's done is, for example, gone to neighborhoods in need and had neighbors create groups for sharing. It's not therapy. It's actually expression of their distress and their hope and their healing. So he's done things like art installations and for war veterans with PTSD, moral distress art exhibits where they can tell their story and others can witness and listen. So at this point with COVID, we've created groups, and we're trying to now create smaller pods, and they have to be tailored. You have to look around and do it within your own microcosm, because there's no, it's not a support group formula. For example, for our young parents, particularly women researchers, they're particularly challenged in their careers, and a lot of them want to drop out and leave academia. And so we're bringing them together for not just problem solving with themselves, but a listening session, so we can see what are the needs that can be met across our institution to help support parents right now.
Nice. And, alongside that, I really think that there is this stress, resilience, happiness revolution going on in a lot of different contexts. And one of my favorites is, we've talked a lot about nature and music and mindfulness, but there's a whole revolution in dance right now. And, there are different organizations like Daybreaker that are getting hundreds of thousands of people dancing. Once we get out of COVID, it's going to be part of this interesting shift that you first noted in our conversation tonight, Elissa, of like moving out of this kind of individualistic self-focus to something more communal. I guess in summing up, I have a big philosophical question and then a smaller question for you, Elissa. And this has been so much fun, as always, talking with you. The big question is, I think, for a long time, people have been thinking about mind-body relationships, and there's the reason, and then there's the body and the flesh and sin, and it's base and animalistic. And I think your kind of work and the work we've been talking about tonight really shifts our understanding of mind and body, right? They're one, they're interacting, they're influencing each other. How do you think about this broad mind-body relationship of the mind is naming things and ruminating and practicing gratitude and seeing silver linings, and then the body is reacting with inflammation and cortisol, telomeres, and vagal tone and the like? How do you think about what's sort of like your key? If I came to you at the mountaintop and I said, Master Epel, what's the secret of the mind-body relationship?
I think when I started probably 25 years ago, I was, a little bit more kind of neck up and
me too.
Really heady about this and skeptical and, trying to show these correlations. And my kind of awe and respect for the mind-body connection has only grown. I mean, I have to suppress things that might sound woo-woo that I say, but like, let's just talk about COVID side effects. I mean, we're studying them and we're measuring things like, do you believe the side effects are your body's, something's wrong? Or do you believe your body is actually strong, fighting? The response means it's doing what it should and it's strong.
Right.
And that is probably going to predict the magnitude of their symptoms and their suffering. And we already know this from research on allergy therapy, that if you welcome your side effects, yes, bring it on. This is this is right. This is a lawful relationship. You give me an antigen and I'm, my immune system's freaking out for good. Then they have a better response to the allergy treatment. I went through a very deeply, traumatic parenting experience. Like nothing gets you like, the parenting care you have for a child. And I had a horrible, dramatic immune reaction. I mean, the immune system's like a drama queen, right? Sometimes with the inflammatory response. And I remember, the concern and the wrongness of it, telling my friend Cliff Sarin, Cliff, who's a contemplative researcher, who said, Elissa, this is like the best news. Everything you study might be true. If you weren't having a response right now, then this stuff is weak, like it's non-significant correlations. And I was like, yes, this is so beautiful, even me, So, so it's just, we're just the social context, our relationships, certainly how we make meaning of things. These are just moving around our nervous system, our hormones, our immune system in ways that we could probably never fully demonstrate, but we learn more all the time to respect this relationship.
Yeah. And I would say, the work that you've done in this field, it also tells us that our nervous systems are connected to other people's nervous systems, and that we have to start grappling with this idea that it's not this solitary self, but we're really very hyper-connected. So my final question for you, Elissa, and I've been asking this a lot of, people during COVID, is what's your favorite positive emotion?
Oh, Dacher, how will I choose? I just want to note, like, I cannot wait to talk to you in a year, since you are mapping positive emotions and measuring them. And it's going to change our dialogue and culture about positive emotions. We're not just going to talk about positive and negative, right? We're going to experience them more when we have names for them and we see how they work in science. So something that's strong we talked about the nature effect, and that is something I don't have words for, really. Yeah. But I seek, and since we haven't had retreats this year, that has been my retreat, is silence in a wild nature place or coast like Sea Ranch. That's been profound. That's been part of my survival during COVID. But I think my easy answer to that is, and I'm going to admit that sometimes I click on clickbait, but it's of positive generosity stories to strangers. And I just really love reading about, the young child who had to walk 5 miles to school every day, and then someone picked them up and then, eventually helped them buy a car. I mean, they're just these phenomenal stories about helping people who a tiny bit of money or help made a huge difference. And it just warms my heart. I just get teary and inspired.
Alan Fisk down at UCLA has studied those, and he calls it kamamuta, which is a name in another language. And he makes the case that we so need to connect to each other and be part of community, that when we see other examples of community and love, like you've just described, we tear up and we feel inspired. And so powerful is our need to be part of this collaborative community. So, wow, that's wonderful. Good choice.
And you, Dacher, I would love to know how you have to choose one. I know you're going to.
Yeah, it has to be awe. I feel Einstein said it was the cradle of, science and spirituality and culture and art. And I agree. I think it's just this most human emotion. It's so full of mysteries. Every time I go out and find it, outside, or listening to some music, or, thinking about some idea, or moving with people, or thinking about human goodness, it makes me feel like I'm part of something important and much bigger than the little self that I am. So it's a good one. Well, Elissa Epel, I could talk to you all night, but we have other occasions to talk about in various parts of our work life. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on this City and Arts and Lecture, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Dacher. This was so much fun. Thanks everyone for your great questions.